Hello, everyone. Welcome to our report launch on wages, benefits, and change. We're very thrilled to have you here with us today. Before we get started, I'd like to go over some logistical items about using the GoToWebinar platform. Please ensure your microphone is muted if you are not speaking. You are very welcome to use the questions panel to interact with the speakers. NASEO staff will share questions and comments at the conclusion of the presenter's remarks. And finally, if you are having trouble with the webinar software, please use the questions feature for troubleshooting guidance from NASEO staff, or feel free to email sfazeli@naseo.org. A quick run through of today's program will include opening remarks and key findings presentation. We're really pleased to have Secretary Moniz with the Energy Futures Initiative, as well as David Terry, the Executive Director of NASEO, Philip Jordan with BW Research Partnership, and we'll conclude with a states panel discussing how states are navigating challenges and opportunities for the energy workforce post-COVID-19, including Tamika Jacques with the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center, Doreen Harris with NYSERDA, Will Torr with the Colorado Energy Office, and a panel moderated by Dave Altoff with the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection. So with no further ado, I will pass the mic to David Terry with the National Association of State Energy Officials. Thanks, David.
Thank you, Sandy, and thanks for joining us today, everyone, for the release of this important report. Before we get started, we have to begin with some important thank yous, starting with the Energy Futures Initiative, EFI, Secretary Moniz, Melanie Kinderdine, Joe Heiser, Jeanette Pablo, David Ellis, Natalie Volk. They have been amazing partners throughout our work on the USER, as well as other activities, the U.S. Energy Employment Report and today's report, and just appreciate their partnership and the broad view they take to clean energy, climate, and energy and economic development and reliability and resilience issues. Also, I want to thank BW Research's Sarah Lehman, who was the lead author of the report today, Mitch Search, and Phil Jordan of BW, who we've had a long and productive partnership with. And I should say both EFI and BW have been very strong partners for the states, our members, and we'll get to more of that in a moment. In 2019 and 2020, our funders coming from dozens of states, foundations, trade associations, and other partners that contributed to the data collection that allowed us to gather the information that went in today's report, all derived in part from the U.S. Energy Employment Report data and other work that the team has done. For those of you that aren't familiar, NASEO, the National Association of State Energy Officials that I lead, is an organization for and about state energy offices. The governor's energy directors, all 56 states, territories, and the District of Columbia are our members, along with their 3,000 plus professional staff of their offices, working on all energy policy and program issues, from grid to energy emergencies, solar, renewables, climate-related economic development through technology advancement, vehicle electrification, really the panoply of activities. Underlying a lot of that is workforce development and making sure we have not only good, well-paying jobs, but also a trained workforce to meet the needs of industry and government as we move the energy economy forward and our overall economy forward. NASEO works both in Washington, D.C. and at the state level to share best practices among the states, but also to share with the federal government, Congress, the administration, regulatory agencies, the views of the states on energy issues. Over the past several years, we've been partnering with EFI and BW to produce the U.S. Energy and Employment Report, or USER as we often call it. It really provides a granular accounting of energy jobs across energy technologies and sectors. It is both conventional and emerging fuels and technologies and resources, and it's a very critical tool for our members at the state level as they develop energy policy and programs, workforce development, but also at the federal level, and certainly for the private sector as they think about how they meet the needs of a changing workforce, changing marketplace, and changing energy interests and needs. Since the start of the U.S. Energy Employment Report, which was created at the Department of Energy during Secretary Moniz's tenure, it's a data that's become integrated in state energy policy and programmatic activities. And it's one of the reasons it's so critical to our organization. It supports our state's work, who have been leading on clean energy and climate issues for many years. Today's report, the wages, benefits, and change, provides really a new layer of understanding around these issues in the energy sector. And you'll hear a lot more about that. As I read progressive reviews of the report, I was just stunned at the quality and level and depth of the data that you'll be seeing today for the first time. So we're very pleased about that. I think it will particularly help policymakers as we move into this phase of discussion of the infrastructure bill that President Biden and his team have put forward and Congress will be considering. And I think it leaves us a lot of opportunities, both in that context, but also in our ongoing work with the private sector and the federal government on moving clean energy and climate-related technologies forward, as well as conventional energy resources that we need, many of which are the foundation of the US economy. So I will pause there so we can get on to the important remarks from our other presenters. As Sandy mentioned, we have next in our lineup former Secretary of Energy Ernest Moniz, who's also the CEO of the Energy Futures Initiative. Our presentations and state presentations will follow that. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Secretary Moniz. And again, thank you for your partnership and your leadership.
Great. Well, thank you all for joining us today to release the Wages, Benefits, and Change report. And I have to say, it's a great pleasure to be back with our friends and partners from NASEO and BW Research Partnership, specifically David Terry and Phil Jordan, as we continue to elucidate what's happening with energy jobs in this country. The Energy Future Initiative's partnership with NASEO and BW Research Partnership has really been incredibly valuable. And certainly without their support, we could not have produced these 3 years of user reports and now wages, benefits, and change. Let me emphasize that the focus on the nature, scale, and evolution of the energy workforce is a critical part of our efforts at EFI because it's a critical part of any successful decarbonization strategy. Without social equity considerations being central to such a strategy, we'll just face headwinds in reaching our climate goals. I also wanted to express my appreciation for the unwavering support for the energy jobs reports by Congress. And while there are many supporters, I'll just single out Senator Shaheen and Chairman Rush and their staffs for consistent support. The data and analysis of these energy jobs reports is more important than ever as the United States charts its course through the energy transition that has been underway with some seriousness for the last couple of decades, primarily due to low-cost natural gas, wind, and solar, and the pace will pick up in the decades ahead. The continuing reports will also be critical for pointing the way on the task of climbing out of the COVID-induced hit to our workforce overall. The importance of this jobs theme to the still young Biden administration, just 76 days old today, is clear. We hear much about the president's proposal last week for an infrastructure bill. In fact, David mentioned that in his opening remarks. But its title, we shouldn't forget, is actually the American Jobs Plan. And within it, there's an unparalleled emphasis as well on unionization as a path to high job quality in addition to quantity. The plan has major implications for clean energy and climate change mitigation and resilience. The president has also issued an unprecedented executive order dealing with secure supply chains, including the batteries essential for an electric vehicle revolution and the critical minerals and metals essential for numerous clean energy technologies like offshore wind. This focus on secure supply chains represents common sense planning for security in meeting a transformed energy sector that is officially, according to DHS, an enabler of all of our other critical infrastructures. And of course, this has enormous implications for energy jobs as well. Understanding the role of energy jobs in stimulating the US economy and in communities will be invaluable as policymakers at the local, state, and federal level address the impact of these changes to the energy system. The bottom line is that the series of jobs reports that we've worked on with NASEO and BW Research Partnership, including today's wage report, provides a foundation for policy development and for planning by governments, labor, and business, as well as for analysis that underpins policy and planning. The report includes in its title the word change. This is important since any semblance of success in meeting ambitious decarbonization goals, specifically net zero by mid-century, means an acceleration of change in the energy sector that we haven't seen before. It's clear the energy sector has changed significantly over the last, say, 150 years. These changes, largely due to technology and market forces, have had profound impacts on energy jobs and the communities that depend upon them over that entire period. In the last 20 years or so, again, the lower price of natural gas and renewables have been strong drivers, as well as state and federal policies and programs designed to decarbonize the U.S. energy system. This will pick up and be a key factor in energy job shifts. For example, the electric utility sector has already decarbonized significantly, leading the way, and 70% of the largest utilities have a net zero mid-century goal. As the grid decarbonizes and is modernized, electrification of other parts of the economy will follow, and we've seen dramatic commitments by the auto manufacturers. GM, no internal combustion engine vehicles by 2035. Ford, we're not going to take a back seat to anybody in this transition. Tesla, valued at well over $500 billion. We're also seeing substantial investment in building the U.S. EV manufacturing supply chain. And let us not forget the investment and shareholder communities who are calling for considerably enhanced corporate climate risk disclosure as a determinant of their investment decisions. All of these trends reinforce the opportunity and need for building the energy workforce while bringing along today's workers. The 5-year U.S. Energy and Employment Report, summarizing the 2015 to 2019 pre-COVID data, showed that the energy workforce represents more than 5% of the entire workforce and importantly grew twice the pace of the overall workforce. Again, profound implications for building back better in the post-COVID world. And now this Wages, Benefits, and Change report points out that hourly median wages across the energy sector are substantially greater than the workforce median, with indications of better benefits as well, particularly in the utility and unionized parts of the energy workforce. With the administration plans, state plans, and business commitments to sharply reduce greenhouse gas emissions, the prospect is for energy workforce expansion for decades. I have a few minutes left, so I'll just highlight a couple of other findings in the report. First, while the energy sector was impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic, the energy industry lost fewer jobs compared to other sectors of the economy. And another key finding is that unionization is an indicator of higher wages and benefits, but there were not sufficiently accurate data on unionization rates. Understanding unionization within the energy sector is important because it can help predict wages across the energy sector. However, a consensus on this data is challenging due to wide variations among data sets within the federal government and organizations. For example, current data sets across the Department of Energy, Bureau of Labor Statistics, and Census Bureau produce varying results across industry segments. One of the key recommendations in the report is standardization of unionization data. Lastly, I urge a close look at the report's considerations for policymakers, which discusses a number of important measures that can assist with the energy transition. With that, again, I'll repeat our great pleasure at collaborating with NASEO and the BW Research Partnership, and I will turn it over to Phil Jordan, who will dive into the report's findings and take questions. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Thank you, David, for your kind remarks. It's been a real pleasure to work with EFI and NASEO these last years. And I just want to not only reiterate our gratitude for this partnership, but also for the leadership in these two organizations and the very dedicated staff members who not only many of whom were directly involved with commencing this series of research while at the Department of Energy, but really leading the charge in making sure that we could continue to do this work and provide these data in the absence of federal leadership and funding. So really appreciate all of the work that went into it and all of the many hours put in by the staff of all the organizations to make sure that that this report could continue. I'm pleased today to walk through the findings of this report and to talk in a little bit more detail about some of the key takeaways and the depth of the data that we were able to produce. So we already had our overview of the organizations, but did want to just mention again that NASEO is the organization that includes the membership of the 56 energy governors designated energy directors from the states and territories and DC, and has really been pivotal in I think in helping states really sort of take this information and think through the various approaches towards their own energy policies. Obviously, the Energy Futures Initiative needs no introduction from us. I would just note that there's a tremendous amount of research that this organization produces that can be found at their website, energyfuturesinitiative.org. And should probably mention my partners on the project team in this from each of the organizations: Sandy Fazeli from NASEO, Jeanette Pablo from EFI, David Ellis from EFI, Natalie Volk, and of course my team, Sarah Lehman and Mitch Church, Ryan Young, and Kobe Frangillo. BW Research has been working on a lot of energy-related research for quite some time, and we started this work in particular in 2015 under the leadership of Secretary Moniz's Energy Jobs Council at DOE. And again, we're just absolutely thrilled to be continuing that partnership with the release of this, we think, critical report. So just as a brief overview, the last iteration of the U.S. Energy Employment Report was released about a year ago in March of 2020. We worked on that project again in the same sort of collaboration as we have with the prior years. The 2020 user project was guided by David Foster with EFI, and I think was a very useful continuation of the research that allowed us to look longitudinally over 5 years of data. One of the key elements I think that is important to recognize is that it was very, very important to all the project team that we replicate and continue the methodological rigor from the DOE guided effort so that these data could be comparable over time. And so I'm very excited that we were able to do that. For those of you who are not familiar with the U.S. Energy Employment Report, in terms of a brief overview, this study was commenced. The work began in 2015 as an annual supplement. It is an employer survey. We interview between 30,000 and 60,000 businesses every year in the fourth quarter of every year. And we designed this together with various departments within the Department of Energy, as well as with colleagues from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, to approximate an annual supplement to the Bureau of Labor Statistics quarterly census on employment and wages. This allows us to integrate our findings and filter the existing data that's updated quarterly by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. We break down the energy sector into 5 broad categories: fuels, electric power generation, transmission, distribution, and storage, which we refer to in our work products as the traditional energy sector. But we also include information on 2 critical demand side sectors for the importance that they have on the energy system. And that includes building efficiency, energy efficiency of buildings, as well as motor vehicles. Within those 5 categories, there are 53 different energy efficiency, motor vehicle, what we call sub-technologies across 186 specific industry codes, which are located among 7 broad industry classifications. So we're talking about things that range from agricultural inputs for biofuels to mining and extraction, construction, manufacturing, professional services, repair and maintenance, and wholesale trade, among others. We certainly spend a lot of the effort of the survey to determine the employment numbers themselves. So understanding who's working where is a critical element of that. But we also dig deeply into the implications of those numbers. We interview the employers about their hiring expectations in the short term to understand their pessimism or optimism, what kind of difficulties they're having in finding the talent that they need, and splitting those out based on the technology with which they work and the industry within their activities are located. And we look to identify the high demand jobs and skill gaps so that we can make sure that supply of talent does not constrain the activities of the employers. We do critical work on workforce demographics by race and ethnicity, gender, veteran status. And we also look at very detailed information on a geographic location at the state and county level to make sure that, and metropolitan statistical area, so that we can really understand the transitions not only from a national perspective, but changes in employment across specific geographic areas. Now, the user report has been widely used by policymakers in the federal and state arenas over the last number of years and has been very valuable. But over those years, we started to get new questions and questions that were increasing in frequency about the quality of the jobs that were being produced and potentially eliminated as a result of changes in the energy sector. So increasingly, we were asked to identify to find more information about these jobs and specifically about their wages and benefits. So in this report, we do base the report on the user series framework, relying on the 5-year trends report that was released last year, supplemental employer wage surveys that were collected in 2018 and 2019, and that are highly, again, tied to the way that the Bureau of Labor Statistics classifies and collects data on employment. We do include wage data for technology sector, sub-technology, what we call industry crosscuts, which is the aggregation of technology activities across different segments of the value chain, and select occupations. And we report on the likelihood or the propensity of employer-sponsored healthcare or contributions to retirement benefits for select occupations. Now, I'll note that this work product, we've been at it for about 2.5 years. I'm going to provide some initial conversations today about the findings. It's about a 135-page report, so I won't be able to do it justice in the short time that I have today to go into great detail, but did want to just emphasize that there's a tremendous amount of data, and we tried to be as transparent and as granular as we could be while maintaining accuracy and fidelity. So in terms of some background and key findings, if we look over the 20-year period that Secretary Moniz referenced, we see these enormous increases in oil and gas and renewable energy production. So a range of 87 to 106% increase in the production, with a 37% decrease in domestic coal production over the same period. As Secretary Moniz mentioned, the U.S. energy sector grew by twice the rate of all jobs between 2015 and 2019. That's 11% growth, and really getting pretty close to 1 million jobs added over that period of time. So really remarkable growth over that period of time. You can see again, tracking the 20-year production data. When we look at a 5-year snapshot, we see really impressive growth numbers in petroleum and natural gas fuels, as well as solar and wind electric power generation. And again, losses in the coal fuels sector. With regards to COVID-19, certainly quite a bit of volatility, a sharp decline that peaked in April 2020 at a 12% total decline in energy employment. This compared with a 20% decline nationwide. and a bit of a rebound from June to December 2020, with about a third of those jobs being added back over the period. So, certainly some room to run, but also certain segments, as we'll discuss in a few minutes, certain segments of the economy are starting to return to pre-pandemic levels of employment or close to it, while others lag significantly behind. That's really critical because of all of the findings in this report, and there are many, I believe that the most important, at least from my perspective in thinking about workforce transitions, is that energy jobs, the median energy jobs that we're talking about here, pay almost to more than double the jobs, the median wage of the jobs that have been most likely to have been lost during the pandemic in retail, accommodations, food service sectors, and others like hospitality and tourism. So that's a really critical finding, because as we see the millions of people who are still out of work, the plurality of those are coming from these hardest hit sectors that maybe are not directly related to energy jobs or don't yet have a very clear pathway into them. But if we get that right, if we get the training and the connection and the integration right, those folks would stand to potentially see their wages doubled from what they were earning before the pandemic. And that's where I think I see a tremendous amount of promise in the months and years ahead. So as Secretary Moniz and Mr. Terry alluded to, energy wages pay significantly more than the national median for the entire US economy. At $25.60 average median hourly wage, that's a 34% premium over the national median wage across all jobs in the economy at $19.14. This again underscores the finding that creating energy jobs will create jobs that pay more than the national median in the US economy. This is not only true overall, it's true for all of the technology, sub-technology sectors studied in this report. So I'll repeat that. Every one of the technology sectors that we looked at in energy efficiency, solar, wind, coal, gas, oil, nuclear, transmission, storage, all pay significantly more than the median hourly wage. Nearly all industries earn higher hourly wages. The only exception is agriculture. We'll show that in a bit, the agriculture, which pays the same wage. So what that means is all of the technology segments pay more than the national median, and all of the industry segments, the energy portion of that work pays more than the non-energy segment of that work. So again, very strong evidence that creating energy jobs for Americans is going to create jobs that pay higher than median wages. Now there's tremendous variation within that. So the range of that premium, right? So it's all positive, but the range of that premium is 27% premium over the national median to 105% above those national median hourly wages. So again, wide range, but all positive. And finally, energy workers in these examined occupations are more likely to receive healthcare and retirement benefits contributions from their employers compared to national private sector averages. So lots of good news about the quality of the energy sector jobs. Now, when we look at the energy sector, energy wages by crosscuts, again, this is the totality of activities around an industry. So when we look at nuclear at the top of the list here, that includes nuclear fuels, that includes power plants, that includes the storage of nuclear fuels, etc. And clearly the highest median hourly wage. So you can see this list, you can see the variation. And what I notice here is that for a lot of the jobs in the energy sector, they're pretty tightly bunched, and then there are some that pay, sort of a more significant premium. There are a few considerations I think that are important to think about with these numbers. And we're going to show a little bit about the industry mix on the next page, but the mix of industries and the accessibility of these jobs really do have a pretty important impact on the median hourly wage. So when we think about the nuclear sector and these high wages, we think that it's important in terms of context to realize that this includes, again, a wide range of occupations. And some of those occupations are things like nuclear engineers, right? Which are very high wage jobs that also have quite a bit of educational preparation required for those positions. So the level of accessibility and availability, the growth rates and the sizes of all of these different technologies are things that should be taken into account as we think about the types of jobs that we're creating. And we have a little sidebar here, which I think is pretty critical, which is that energy efficiency is by far the largest segment of these technology industry crosscuts that we're looking at. It has had strong and consistent growth rates over time. It tends to have a fairly low barrier to entry in terms of the skill and education requirements for entry. And critically, energy efficiency jobs can be found in almost every U.S. county. There are only 6 counties where we were unable to find any energy efficiency employment. Now, when we look at the wages by industry, this really helps us to understand the core determining factor of that of the technology crosscut wage discrepancies. What we find here is that for nearly, as I mentioned, all of these industry segments, there's a pretty significant premium over the national median wage, and that's that middle column there. But there's also a significant premium over the overall industry, not just the energy portions of it. So as an example, if we look at the third one down in utilities, the energy utilities pay a 10% premium over utilities overall, right? So pretty substantial finding there. But obviously, right, when you look at these median hourly wages by industry, the greater percentage of jobs that you have in things like utilities, right, and things like transportation and mining and extraction, et cetera, will have higher wages than if the technology has substantial components of wholesale trade or manufacturing or construction or services. So just the key finding there is that the mix of the industries has a big impact on the median wages, and in fact, the largest impact that we were able to identify. So here's just an example of what we're talking about here. If we look at the storage crosscut, what we find is an overall premium that is quite impressive over the national median. But we also look at each of the segments, and this is just to show you the depth of detail that we have in the report. Each of these segments and whether or not the storage in this case portion of that business pays more or less. So when we look across, say, construction, we find that construction workers working in the storage sector actually get paid a premium of 8.3% over the median hourly wage for construction overall. So really, this sort of shows that not only do we sort of categorize the employment breakdowns by these different categories as part of our data sets in our 5-year and each annual user, but we are now able to add significant level of detail into the premium or discount for each of the specific industries within these crosscuts. Similarly, we can look at natural gas and see across the board where these premiums are paid across a variety of segments, and we see the substantial overall and within each of the industries premiums paid in the natural gas sector. Again, as was alluded to in the preamble of this discussion, geographic shifts are really important for us to address, right? And especially as we start thinking about the quality of jobs and the wages paid. The report does have quite a lot of detail in looking at state level changes in different technologies over time. This is an area that we think is also really critical. I would note that this has been mentioned more than a few times in the discussion around the American Jobs Plan. in the importance of ensuring that the jobs that are created are not only good paying jobs that have all of the sort of just transition elements that have been discussed, but that they're also local. So these data, we think, help to really underscore the importance of that as we see changes in the energy sector and we see changes in technology mix and industry mix, that those changes will impact the country in very different ways depending on the community in which you reference. So we certainly have, through the course of doing all this work, we have come up with a number of considerations for policymakers that we think are important. You know, the first real takeaway is, you know, as probably as evidenced by a 135-page report, is that, you know, everybody wants a quick and easy headline to be able to explain what's happening within energy sector jobs and jobs quality and the impact of decarbonization on the quality of jobs. And what we found is that this is a very, very nuanced picture. So there are a variety of factors, and Secretary Moniz mentioned unionization rate, clearly an important factor in job quality and wages. Other things that are critical are the industry mix, as I mentioned, right? Are these largely construction and manufacturing jobs, or are they largely utility jobs or other types of higher wage industry jobs? What are the qualifications, experience, and training that's required? You know, in other words, how accessible are these jobs to individuals? So, so clearly there's a lot of nuance in here, right? And it's very hard to sort of pull out a single takeaway. At the same time, we do see this significant trend and an opportunity for creating desirable jobs, right? And so there are a few considerations that we think are really important in that endeavor. You know, the first is that, as I mentioned, some of the segments in the overall US economy are starting to rebound fairly quickly. One of those that I've been watching very closely is the construction sector. And when you go by a city skyline or looking even in residential construction in neighborhoods, it looks like there's a lot of construction going on, and we've heard a lot about supply chain shortages, right? I don't think there's any lumber in any of the lumber shops around my part of the country due to increases in construction. And actually, the report released just this Friday by the Bureau of Labor Statistics that tracks monthly unemployment data shows that construction is almost back to pre-pandemic levels of employment and is likely to be there soon, right? So it's down about 90,000 jobs from pre-pandemic levels, and it's adding jobs fairly quickly as a result of a growing construction boom. So if we are to create lots of new construction jobs as we build out a new and updated and modernized grid and energy system, we are going to have to think differently about workforce funding and programming to make sure that we're supporting pathways and pipelines from people who have been working in perhaps very far-flung fields to be able to transition readily and successfully into construction roles. One key element of that is that we think the DOE could lead an effort to find more granular detail on skills competencies. The ONET system that is currently used by the federal government is terrific. It has good amounts of specificity on skills and competencies, and developing something to that level of detail or beyond, we think will be critical to ensuring that we can create these kinds of pathways. And so we are hopeful that DOE could lead an effort to do just such a thing. Another key area will be registered apprenticeship. Registered apprenticeship is something that has proven to work. One addition that we'd like to see, and we know that many are working on, and there's some good success models that are out there, is many of the folks who find themselves still unemployed in due to the COVID pandemic are not ready to enter into an apprenticeship program. Some of those people were unemployed before the pandemic. Some were working in fields where they may not have possessed the prerequisite requirements to enter into the registered apprenticeship program. So we think that there is a significant opportunity for partnership among training providers to provide pre-apprenticeship training and more apprenticeship funding so that we can ensure that there's a solid pipeline of workers to enter the apprenticeship who are ready to go on day one. Obviously, we think that it's not only the federal government that needs to be thinking about these things, and NASEO has taken a strong leadership position in ensuring that local and state policymakers have the data that they need. And we think that there's a lot more that could be done to, and that will be done for states to be able to examine the impacts of and potential responses for these transitions. And we applaud NASEO for the work that it's already doing, and hope to see that certainly continue. There are a few other interesting considerations that we found as we were sort of producing this report and talking with experts in the field. One is that, I'll just give an example that there is a real significant opportunity around the growing offshore wind sector. And we've seen recent announcements from the White House about the expansion of the offshore wind sector, particularly along the eastern seaboard, and a number of states. And I don't want to go too far into this because I know we have panelists from states that are all thinking about this. But one of the interesting things that we uncovered in the research is that there are certain sort of pinch point occupations where Massachusetts might need a couple of hundred offshore welders or pile drivers for a short period of time, where it may not make sense to say, hey, we're going to train 200 people locally to work on these projects and then wait for the next project to come along or other work to happen, when these projects are happening all the way really from Maine to North Carolina over time and beyond. One of the challenges that's been raised is that it's very important to have the certification and licensure requirements have reciprocity across the states. One of our profiles in the report actually highlights how a large project developer on the East Coast of offshore wind is actively working with labor unions in order to be able to meet these short-term pinch points, because it's so much easier for them to work with a local labor union who can then pull in members from other surrounding states and areas who have the same skill sets. And we just need to make sure that that process is as smooth as possible, because it's one that obviously the labor unions are excited about. It's one that the project developers have deemed critical, and can really help make these projects go more smoothly. We also think that it's really important that we understand the geographic and different implications, industrial, occupational, technological implications of different mechanisms and investment strategies. And I will just sort of suggest that I was very encouraged when we had put these findings together to see in the American Jobs Plan that it appears to be there are models for that already exist, even just in sort of the executive summary, you can see it. And I'll give an example here, right? We can think about pipeline construction jobs and how a decarbonized fuel sector in the short term, someone could say, there's a lot of pipeline construction jobs that could be negatively impacted by, by these changes, right? What the American Jobs Plan does and lays out is a framework that I think that could be very valuable and illustrative. There's a short-term, a medium-term, and a long-term strategy, right? And so in the short term, part of the answer is we're going to replace all the lead pipes, right? And we're going to modernize our existing infrastructure, and that's work that needs to happen tomorrow, and that's work that needs to happen in pipeline construction tomorrow. But then also looking out further in the plan, we start to see things like hydrogen and movement and storage of carbon. And those are longer term strategies that then suggest maybe there actually is a thoughtful guide path to the arc of a career where someone who's working today will have enough work to do in a high wage job that's very similar to what they're doing in the same geographic location over this long time horizon. And so we're hopeful that the data in these reports and in this report today that we specifically are releasing can be useful in thinking through policies in just that way. Secretary Moniz mentioned concerns about union data and some of the challenges there. We think that the National Economic Council could be a really interesting and important convener in this space to convene the relevant stakeholders to make sure that we're establishing protocols and methodologies so that there's consistency across the data collections. And then finally, and of course, really thinking about the COVID-19 impacts. When we have the opportunity to create a substantial number of jobs, and when we have a substantial number of people who are still out of work, thinking through this specific moment of COVID-19 and the energy transition and how jobs will be created, lost, and changed, we think is critical to moving forward. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen. And appreciate your comments, and I will turn it over to Sandy, who can bring us into the remainder of our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Phil. That was a great presentation. I'd now like to invite Dave Althoff with the Pennsylvania State Energy Office and our state panelists to join.
Okay, hello. I'm Dave Althoff, the Director of the Energy Programs Office at the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection. And I'd especially like to thank NASEO, EFI, BW Research Partnerships on this very important work that really helps us with this important but challenging information and the analysis thereof. I think it helps us connect in my state and all the rest of the states our energy policy and program implementation efforts, and how this information really connects with what Phil was saying, the American Jobs Plan, jobs in our state, and really jobs in our communities. So that's what we want to talk about today. I'm honored to be asked to moderate this panel, which we will focus on how states are navigating the energy sector workforce development, especially in this time of energy market transition, post-pandemic recovery, and calls to address racial, gender, and income disparities in the US economy. So I'm sure that every state feels like they are at the epicenter of this. And Pennsylvania, as the keystone state, a resource-rich state, a state that exports energy resources to our surrounding neighbors and to the world, is certainly feeling the energy market transition. I mean, in our state, especially from coal to gas, but also the opportunities that clean energy provides to us. You know, we're seeing our neighboring states take advantage of clean energy opportunities, especially as they are related to their resources. And in some cases, those are wind, solar, biofuels, et cetera. So I think it's important for us as Pennsylvania, but for everyone, to learn what those opportunities are providing for them, how they're gearing up for that, and how we can work together to replicate opportunities, as in jobs, for a workforce transition and development within our states and within our communities, but also how it connects to equity and recovery from COVID. So that's what I wanted to say as a lead into this panel, but we want to hear more from our panelists, which we have from Colorado, Will Torr, from Massachusetts, Tamika Jacques, and from New York, Doreen Harris. And so what I'm going to ask is that each panelist provide a brief introduction of themselves, basically a who you are, what you do, and who you do it for, and maybe a high-level brief statement on why workforce investments are important to the energy sector in your state. So with that, I will start with Colorado and Will.
Thank you, David. Yeah, I'm Will Torr, the Executive Director of the Colorado Energy Office. I work with the Polis administration on advancing the clean energy and climate agenda of the administration. We are committed to achieving deep greenhouse gas emissions reductions. We have a goal of a 50% reduction by 2030 and 90% by 2050, and an aspirational target of 100% clean electricity generation by 2040. What we are seeing is that there is an enormous energy transition happening in Colorado. Electric utilities that represent about 99% of our fossil generation have adopted plans to get to at least an 80% emission reduction by 2030 that include retiring virtually every coal plant in the state of Colorado. We're also seeing significant momentum towards both building electrification and transportation electrification that I think have significant implications for the labor market across the state. A few of the issues that I think that we see as being just issues that we need to grapple with. One are the real regional differences across the state. We see many new jobs being created and new opportunities, building new transmission, building and maintaining wind farms, significant utility scale solar investments. But those are primarily on the eastern plains of Colorado and in southern Colorado. The coal jobs that are going away are primarily in northwestern Colorado. We see some disconnects between where some negative impacts are taking place and where a lot of the job creation is taking place. Just a couple of other things I would note in the introduction are that in the realm of building electrification, that's an arena where we are seeing sort of real workforce challenges that the both policy interest and the sort of demand for electrification right now, I think, is greater than either number of contractors or workers who are really trained in building electrification. So we see significant sort of needs and opportunities there. And then finally, would note that we are really just in the early phases of really trying to understand the role of both carbon capture and green and blue hydrogen in achieving our state climate and energy goals, and think that there are potentially some really interesting opportunities for oil and gas workers in those arenas as the energy transition sort of broadens in Colorado.
Thank you, Will. That was terrific. I'd like to turn to Tamika. Tamika, would you please tell us who you are, what you do, who you do it for, and give us a statement on why workforce investments are important to the energy sector in your state.
All right, yeah, thank you for having me. To everyone that is on this call and for inviting me. As David said, my name is Tamika Jacques. I am the Director of Workforce Development at the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center, and we are considered a quasi-agency, which means that we're not necessarily a state entity, but we do report into the Executive Office of the Environment. And we are funded by the ratepayers of Massachusetts. So David, when you ask who do we do this for, we are essentially doing this for everyone in Massachusetts, as you know, a little bit of funding comes in from each electric bill in Massachusetts. So essentially, we look at this as a statewide, you know, effort. If you have been following the news, you've heard about Massachusetts and our climate bill that was passed a few weeks ago, and that is to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. And in that, actually, there was some funding for the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center to focus on the program, some of the programs that Will mentioned, but also to really have a focus on women and minorities in the building sector, as well as helping them to get state certified and to start new businesses. And so essentially, you know, during the pandemic, as we talk about the flagship program at Massachusetts, as we call it, MassCEC, was our internship program. And so we place over 500 students per year in internships where MassCEC pays for those students to be at a business, and we reimburse for the wages. And so, you know, during the pandemic, it was, okay, what do we do with these college students that now, you know, have to go back to, you know, their place of their home where they live, and how do we also be able to meet the employer's needs, because they also need to keep business going. And so we really had to shift that, you know, in the past, it wasn't so much you could work from home, allowing students to do that. But now, essentially, you know, our employers have really found the niche with working with students, as well as we worked with vocational schools. So we're also working on the technical side. Our college program really addressed the white collar workforce, but we also knew that during the pandemic, we had to really make sure that we were addressing the blue collar workforce in Massachusetts. So we made sure that, you know, talking to employers and talking to vocational students that their needs were being met as well as trying to create programs for those people that are in technical programs but are not on an academic schedule. So, that's our next iteration, that will come through the pandemic. We want to make sure that we're really meeting the white collar workforce in Massachusetts and the blue collar workforce. Part of the climate bill, it had, we are going to offshore wind. Again, if you follow the news, part of that bill was including offshore wind in that bill. And so, offshore wind, buildings, electrification, that is what we are working on in Massachusetts through the pandemic. And really just making sure making sure that, when when you think of diversity, you think of looking at it as a race issue, but oftentimes diversity is age too, right? So the earlier that we can bring the clean energy awareness to our K through 12 system will really create that pipeline for us for people to be in buildings and for, to increase our workforce in offshore wind, especially with as the unions, to make sure that those career pathways are open. So for us, really, we do it for all the residents of Massachusetts, but really from the young to the oldest resident in Massachusetts, we want to make sure that they are captured, whether it's an incumbent worker, an underemployed worker, or especially during the pandemic where we lost, 13,000 jobs. And so we want to make sure that we're meeting those people, those jobs that were lost in clean energy, but not only clean energy, but how we can transition from some of those hospitality jobs or those retail jobs that Phil was talking about. How can we also meet their needs to get them to join our industry?
All right, thank you, Tamika. We obviously hit on something that you are passionate about. It comes through for sure. So I'd like to move to Doreen. Doreen, same question to you. If you could provide an introduction and say, a brief statement on why workforce investments are important to the energy sector in your state.
Sure, yeah, thank you for having me today. I really do appreciate the opportunity to speak on a topic I feel equally passionate about. So, well, we'll see. Hopefully that also comes through. But I am the acting president and CEO of NYSERDA. We are the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority. We're the state's clean energy agency for sure. We occupy a lot of aspects of the space. Not only from a planning office, but also very much an implementation office on behalf of New Yorkers statewide. In New York, we have the framework of the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act that drives our investments in this area. And notably, this act, which was signed into law in 2019, remains the most aggressive climate and clean energy initiative in the nation. So what that means for us is that fundamentally, we look at this energy transition through a very different lens now that we have the Climate Act to guide us. We are looking at a path to carbon neutrality across all sectors of our economy. And so that means it's more than just the electricity sector, it's every sector all around our state, with very specific goals in the Climate Act, such as an 85% carbon emissions reduction by 2050, just to give you some idea of the scale. And so when we think about the Climate Act and its achievement, there are many components. We can talk about them together, but 6,000 megawatts of solar, 3,000 megawatts of storage, and 9,000 megawatts of offshore wind, just to give you some ideas of the magnitude of the commitment that we've made. But I think notably and relevant for today's discussion, it is the fact that the CLCPA also sets a goal for New York agencies to direct investments in our programs so that at least 35% of benefits, with a goal of 40% of benefits of those investments, are directed to disadvantaged communities. And that's really, the framework through which the Climate Act exists is one not only of very aggressive goals, but a very critical aspect to ensure that no New Yorker is left behind in that transition. And so I have the pleasure of co-chairing New York's Climate Action Council, which is charged with developing a scoping plan to advance this agenda. And as we speak, we have 7 sector-specific advisory panels that are advancing our work, including the Just Transition Working Group, which I co-chair with the Department of Labor here in our state. And really, you know, to your very specific question, that's really where this all comes together in New York, is that we see these goals not only from the perspective of the very significant benefits they will realize from a climate perspective, but notably also from, again, a benefits perspective broadly and a jobs creation aspect as well. So when I look at the Just Transition Working Group that I co-chair, we're looking at exactly these issues. How do we ultimately arm a brand new industry across the state? How do we transition workers from one role to another? And how do we realize the fact that, you know, ultimately our state will look quite different, but in fact, quite improved, you know, 10 or 20 years from now. So I'm happy to talk about how we're actually achieving it, but I would consider workforce development as being central to the Climate Act and the benefits associated with it.
Thanks, Doreen. That's I'm really happy to hear you bring climate into this conversation in that way. My office, the Energy Programs Office, is also in charge of our climate action plan, both doing our greenhouse gas inventory for the state and also our impacts assessment. And I think you're hitting the nail right on the head there. When you look at the impacts and where the impacts are, it brings in all of these other pieces, especially just transition. And that's where I want to go next. And I want to turn to Will. I have a specific question for Will in Colorado, and I will have Doreen, you and Tamika follow up as well. But Will, I'm aware that the Colorado Energy Office has been serving on the Colorado Just Transition Advisory Committee, which was created a few years ago to assist workers in communities that will be adversely affected by the loss of jobs and revenues due to the closure of coal mines and coal-fired power plants, something I'm familiar with in Pennsylvania as well. Where do you see the biggest opportunities for assistance coming from this Just Transition Advisory Committee?
You know, it's a great question. And so 2 years ago, when our legislature adopted our Climate Act and the direction to electric utilities to rapidly decarbonize, at the same time they passed the legislation creating the Office of Just Transition that's really focused, I would say, both on the workers in the coal mines and coal power plants, but also on the communities where those facilities are located. And you know, a number of things that I think have become clear as we've worked on this over the last couple of years. First is that we're somewhat lucky in that we have a little bit of lead time here, that many of our coal plants will be retiring in the second half of the 2020s. And so we have a number of years for planning, which also is giving the opportunity that for the coal power plant workers, I think we're going to see very few layoffs, that there's going to be an ability to use retirements and to transfer people into other opportunities within the utilities. So the place where I think we may see some of the larger impacts will actually be in the coal mining sector. One of the arenas that we're really focused on right now is looking for opportunities in those communities for economic development that is based upon the specific assets associated with the utilities. So those power plants may be going away, but the transmission lines are still there. The water rights that the utilities have, they haven't yet disposed of. So where is there opportunity in the electric resource planning arena to actually look at additional investments in those communities? They're not great locations for utility scale wind or solar, but as we think about things like the opportunities for storage and for innovative storage investments, that's one of the arenas. I'd have to say that I think all of our ears perked up last week when the American Jobs Plan was surfaced at the idea of things like 15 demonstration sites for green hydrogen in distressed communities. You know, those sorts of opportunities I think we're very interested in. The other piece that I would say is that we're beginning now on sort of coordinated efforts to work with individual workers through our Department of Labor and Employment in developing sort of transition plans and training plans. Ultimately, we think that there is a federal strategy that is needed for energy transition workers in order to be able to address the level of investment in retraining and the need for temporary wage support during that time period. So we're very focused both on what we can do as a state, but also on that need for a federal investment.
Okay, cool. Tamika and Doreen, I'd like you to follow up on Will's comments, only, obviously the transition looks different in different states. I was asking Will specifically about coal and coal mining communities. So, what does the transition look like in Massachusetts, Tamika, and what does it look like in New York, Doreen, if at all they are different?
Yeah, sure. So I think, in Massachusetts, a few years ago, now we are really, the just transition is really looking at environmental justice. We call them environmental justice communities or environmental justice blocks. So like Will, you're looking into those communities, making sure that they have access to, the jobs and the transition, whether it's a PowerPoint closing, and being able to transition some of that into, some of the work being done on the offshore wind, for example. And so for us, it's just looking at those, in those blocks across Massachusetts, especially if they're defined under environmental justice, to making sure that they are, that there's a public involvement plan as part of that, right? So that, stakeholders are able to engage on that and able to, submit comments and in the right time and talk about the workforce and, how to get people in those communities employed and transitioning over. So for us, it's really having all the agencies that fall under our environmental agency and making sure that we're all working together and communicating and making sure that especially those environmental justice populations are aware of the access and what is happening in their community, what's coming down, what's going up, and that we are there to support that.
Thanks. Doreen, anything?
Sure, yes. Ultimately, there are aspects of this which very much have to do in today's environment with sustaining the jobs that we all had before the pandemic set in. I think this ends up getting a little bit mixed up with respect to sort of what we're seeking to maintain versus what we're seeking to grow. And so I would say just, in the first instance, we have such an incredible clean energy workforce already serving our state. Prior to 2020 and the onset of the pandemic, we had nearly 164,000 clean energy workers across the state. And that we were seeing, I think it's very important to note that we were seeing job growth in the clean energy sector far greater, in fact, than the overall economy, growing over 3% from 2018 to 19. And so ultimately, if you were to ask us all, and I think, perhaps notably New York and Massachusetts and the northeastern states, we did see a decline in clean energy job growth in 2020. Not surprisingly, although significant, New York's decline was far below the national average of 9%. Our decline was around 4.9%. But I think it's important to note that now, as we pivot, looking forward rather than sort of looking at what 2020 resulted in, we see, if we look back to 2018 and 19, we see clean energy as an economic driver that will ultimately not only help New York and other states recover from the pandemic, but fundamentally transform the economy. And so when we look at our workforce initiatives, it's very much with that in mind, that we are talking about brand new skill sets, we're talking about new geographies, we're talking about new needs that, again, can only be encompassed in this concept of a just transition, which is to bring our state full stop into a new industry that will benefit us in ways we probably wouldn't have even imagined, right, in 2019 when the Climate Act was adopted. So that's really how we think about it, and we're taking tangible measures to realize it, which I'm happy to talk about separately.
Great. I want to stick with you. I have a sort of a new question, which is, being a neighboring state, and I don't want to flatter you too much, but certainly NYSERDA sets a high bar for us as state energy offices with the things that you're doing, especially to advance your clean energy workforce. I think you offer sort of a range of funding opportunities for job placement and training, that you publish an annual study of the state's clean energy workforce. You mentioned you're co-chairing the climate committee. I believe you have a just transition working group as well, like Will. So, is that all of the things that you are doing? Are there more? How do you manage all of that? How does it sort of help you advance towards your goals? And then later on, obviously not every state is NYSERDA, right? Or New York with NYSERDA. So for smaller states, who may not necessarily have that kind of bandwidth, where's the starting point, or what maybe is the most important thing to focus on first? I wonder if you had some thoughts around that.
Other states can get a NYSERDA franchise if they'd like. Just saying, we're equal opportunity. But no, it is true. There are many states that don't have the framework of a NYSERDA to drive. The real benefit of an agency like NYSERDA, and in our case a public benefit corporation, is that we look not only to sort of plan policies, but also execute on them, and ultimately have a rather large organization that's dedicated to that solely. And so that's what's awesome about leading NYSERDA, is that I can look at the need and address the need all in one fell swoop. So yes, we have infused over $100 million in workforce development efforts at NYSERDA, and we have prioritized the training for the priority populations that we're talking about here. It's not just low-income individuals. I think it's important to note entities like veterans or Native Americans, individuals with disabilities, the formerly incarcerated, and the like. We are well on our way to training over 40,000 clean energy workers in the next couple of years alone. So I do think the magnitude of what NYSERDA does is not necessarily transferable, but I think it's important to note that when we look at the opportunity, we do look at it across all of the sectors that we're trying to achieve. So I think each state really does need to look at where their benefits will lie, to the points that Will made. Colorado is quite different than New York State, as an example. In our case, we're investing $20 million in offshore wind training, for instance. That's obviously not tremendously applicable in Colorado, but at the same time, the supply chain may be so. But in our world, industries like offshore wind, industries like clean heat, as an example, where we're training 25% of the workers from disadvantaged communities, or programs that are now being, it looks like, rolled out on a federal level, around Climate Justice Corps, for instance, to fund fellowships over the next few years. These are the types of programs that we're implementing in New York. Now, with respect to a smaller state, it is true, I think there needs to be a hard look at the opportunity space that is most applicable. But also, I think the key for us, and I think for any state, is to begin awareness and education at a young age is absolutely critical, and all the way through college. To build comprehensive career pathway programming, I think, is absolutely critical to preparing the workforce of the future. So that's something we can all do. I also think for states with limited resources, coordination with other agencies is essential. What we are trying to build is an ecosystem that isn't existing just in the energy agencies space. We work very closely, for instance, with our economic development agencies, with our labor agencies, and also with the education systems across the state. And with organized labor, like unions and manufacturers and trade organizations. Ultimately, any state can build these ecosystems, no matter the scale. But really, when we're talking about the goals we're trying to achieve, they're transformative, which means that it isn't just about one slice. It's about the entire ecosystem of the state, no matter how big or small. So I think, you know, there's a lot to be learned from thinking about it in that way.
That's great. I'm told that Phil Jordan's going to join our panel and we're going to take some questions from the audience. But while that is happening, I would like to follow on with what you just said, Doreen, and throw that to both Will and Tamika, which is, you know, where and how have your offices found partners that have been critical to the success in your efforts? Doreen sort of identified a number of them that other states can look at, but have there been other partners that you've found that have been critical to your success? Will, then Tamika.
So yes, I think there are a number. You know, certainly one has been the labor unions, and you know, one of the areas that I think has been very fruitful over the last couple of years has been much closer collaboration between the state in our energy and climate work, the environmental community, and labor unions as we're designing programs to ensure that sort of job training and apprenticeship is built into those programs. The place where that is probably most evident is in our programs that involve electric and gas utilities, where we are seeing the utilities playing a really large role in the energy transition as we create sort of essentially new obligations for them to invest in transportation electrification and building electrification and expanded energy efficiency programs. I think we're now moving into a world where there's an expectation that if we're using ratepayer dollars to invest in those programs, that the jobs that are going to be created are going to be good, you know, well-paying, family-sustaining jobs, and that there will be apprenticeship opportunities to sort of bring new people, you know, up to the skill level to be able to do those jobs. So that's one arena I would highlight. And then the other would be really our community colleges, and you know, there's just a lot of interest from our community colleges in where, you know, the role that they can play in creating energy sector pathways for students. And in fact, we're working right now on legislation that would sort of fine-tune energy sector pathway opportunities through our community colleges. So those are two that I would highlight.
Great. Tamika, any partners you found that have been critical?
Yeah, absolutely. I just wanted to respond to Doreen too, because she said if anyone wants to create a subsidiary of NYSERDA, just send the money. We'll create it. No problem. No worries. So yeah, absolutely. Partnerships with the community colleges, the labor unions, the higher education system, you know, creating certificate programs, you know, you definitely have to use community colleges as well as our own workforce training providers in Massachusetts. I think that they definitely have been a great help to us, as well as really reaching out more to the affinity groups, helping us to make our, you know, communities diverse, right? To focus on that component. So definitely, you know, like Will said, the community colleges and the labor and workforce, you know, sits on our board. The Massachusetts Executive Office of Labor and Workforce also sits on our board. So absolutely, there's definitely, in order to make these programs successful, you have to have partnerships in play.
Okay, great. So here's one of the questions from the audience, and I think, Phil, you're going to be involved in this answer. So how can policymakers and others respond to the narrative that it seems that a lot of fossil jobs pay more than a lot of the newer non-fossil or clean energy jobs being created? And I think you touched on that in your presentation with some of your data, but I think we need to be able to appropriately point to not only data, but also make the case, because not all jobs are created equal, as we all know. So Phil, maybe you could start with that and we can go around the panel and just react to what you say, Phil.
Sure thing. Yeah, and I'll try to be brief, though. It's obviously a pretty nuanced answer, right? And a lot of this comes down when we talk about, you know, a fossil job or a non-fossil job as being sort of what are you comparing to and what part of the industry are you talking about? Am I going to tell you that a petroleum engineer working in a refinery it would be an appropriate transition for that person to be a helper or apprentice on a residential solar rooftop installation crew. No, right? No, that's not what I'm going to suggest. So, you know, I touched on sort of the shorter and longer term strategies that I think are important. The key narrative, I think, here, right, is one is that you should neither take the approach that policy interventions or thoughtfulness about just transitions are useless because they all pay the same. We know that's not true, right? So the work that NYSERDA is doing and Colorado is doing in just transitions is critically important for us to be asking these questions. At the same time, there are a lot of jobs in the fossil industry that don't pay that well, right? And are not necessarily jobs that everybody wants, and there are jobs in non-fossil that pay more, right? So the way that I would think about this is when we think about the entirety of the opportunity that exists to create lots of jobs in modernizing the infrastructure and in this accelerating transition, right? What I would say is that there are some really direct job category to job category, wage premium to wage premium activities. And I'll give an example, and then I'll let the states weigh in. One of the things that I haven't seen a lot of talked about in the federal plan, at least, is in the more local electricity distribution and the infrastructure of localized grids and the importance of modernizing those grids to actually facilitate all the other things that are going to be happening in this energy sector transition. So there's a lot about the big transmission, right? The big heavy duty transmission. But when you think about how an energy grid will change when you start electrifying buildings at scale, when you start electrifying vehicles at scale, when you start increasing distributed resources, when we start talking about interconnection of offshore wind into the grid systems, and I think probably both Doreen and Tamika will think about all the work that goes into that. That's an enormous amount of activity, and those jobs are of the highest paying jobs in the energy sector. Those transmission, power line jobs, interconnection type jobs, microgrids, smart grids, all those types of activities are really high paying jobs. So I think that what we have to do is say there are going to be some jobs where there's really direct one-to-one activities. There are going to be other jobs that maybe are paying less than some segments, but when we look at the totality, right, we shouldn't be in a situation where somebody is taking a lower wage job because that's all that's available. We're going to create enough jobs that those folks are taken care of by and large, right? Then we have a tremendous pipeline to help people who are earning below standard wages to now start earning sustainable family wage careers in these clean technologies, right? So the takeaway there is these are not low wage jobs, right? There's a lot of good jobs in this sector, in these new jobs. And then, as Will mentioned, and I think it's exactly the right point, then there are some where you say, now we have a community that had, say, a coal-fired power plant that is being taken offline, and a new energy infrastructure is going to go into place, whether that's an advanced natural gas plant somewhere 100 miles away, or distributed resources, renewable resources, or whatever it is. There has to be thoughtfulness around what happens in that community and to those workers. And I think that's what these just transition working groups are doing across the country. So that's the highly nuanced answer, and I'd be interested to hear what the other panelists think of that.
Yeah, I'd like to go to Tamika first. Tamika,
Yeah,
do you
sure.
have a reaction to that?
Yeah, so in the interest of time, I'll be quick. I think that, Phil is absolutely spot on, especially in Massachusetts, where we are, definitely a union state. So we already set prevailing wages, right? Our unions start with prevailing wages, and that's important. So like Phil said, people are not going to be underpaid, but that's why it's important, as MassCEC does, we're investing in those incumbent workers as well, because we're talking about, as you move along in your career, what stackable credential, these career pathways that we're talking about today, there are numerous stackable credentials that can go on top of each credential that you're getting. So eventually, yes, you will move, to the top, but that's why it's important to invest in not just your entry-level workers, but your incumbent workers, to make sure that that career pathway is really smooth and that they're getting those stackable credentials so that they can, move up. I mean, one thing we always brag about in Massachusetts is, the starting wages for everyone. In our reports, you can see what's the average wage, of a clean energy worker. And I think that's the draw. We do have a higher wage in Massachusetts, and we can brag about that. And so I think for us, it's just making sure we invest in those incumbent workers to make sure that they are getting their stackable credentials.
Doreen, 1 minute.
Oh boy, 1 minute. I didn't know that. But it is true. I couldn't agree with Phil more. And of course, we've benefited greatly from BW Research's insights as we've advanced our work. But he is spot on with respect to the balance of issues at play. Our Just Transition Working Group is looking at, first, those businesses that are ultimately affected. What is the impact on trade exposed industries and energy intensive industries in the state? Business leakage is a huge issue and a huge concern when you think about these types of policies. Second, we need to know where the power plants are that are going to be decommissioned ultimately and what the impacts will be. What will the reuse options be for those sites? Ultimately, there's a variety of options, but I think that's critical as well from a geographic perspective. And third, we have an ongoing job study that is looking at an initial set of workforce recommendations. But ultimately, when we think about this generally, it is the truth that we are looking at a combination of, displaced worker support, the provision of labor standards across the industry, very critical, financial support for businesses as being critical, as well as ongoing training, career pathway programs, and community engagement as being critical preconditions for this transition that we're about to see.
Will, 1 minute.
Yep. So as not to repeat anything that's been said here, I think I'll go in a slightly different direction, which is that I think that as we sort of look out at the large scale energy transition, one of the pieces that I think has been missing, and that from Colorado perspective, we're very excited about that we're seeing out of the Biden administration plans, is really the industrial policy focus on making sure that we're not just importing these technologies into the United States, but that we are looking at how do we actually build a manufacturing supply chain within the country for things like electric vehicle batteries and in the solar industry. And so as we look at where are some of the really good jobs that have been created in Colorado, there's very high-end sort of jobs that are sort of in sort of the R&D space and sort of the emerging business space. There's also some really good manufacturing jobs that we've gotten in the wind industry. And so as we think about the potential for bringing manufacturing jobs, especially in batteries is where, I think there's going to be big opportunities in the future. I think that the Biden administration focus on that is just a key part of making this work for everybody.
I totally agree. I don't think we can talk about this subject enough. I think that we could probably spend the rest of the afternoon. I would just like to ask if you have a concluding thought. We'll start with you, Doreen, if you have a concluding thought, and maybe what's the next thing you're going to do on workforce?
Sure. Yes. So we are going to continue to ramp up these training programs that we've talked about here. These workers need to be ready at the right time and in the right place. And so, we're going to be targeted and efficient with respect to those programs. But I would say at the same time, we also have a strong commitment to supporting these just transition goals for fossil fuel workers that are working across the state. There's huge transferability, but only if we make it so. And I think, for us, there is a huge focus on diversity. We need the diversity of the clean energy businesses in New York to represent those across New York who are diverse in every respect. So I think, when we think about our work, it's cross-cutting, it's engaging in communities directly, and ultimately a collaborative method to not only evaluate what models are working, but sort of where we need to be in the future. So I think we move the whole ship forward together.
I agree. And I think that we need to strengthen those weak points. And this is an opportunity to do that. Tamika, I'd like to throw it to you for a concluding thought. And what are you doing next?
Yeah, so we are, of course, working toward this new climate bill, net zero emissions by 2050, and working on, those 2,400 megawatts of offshore wind, as well as now we have funds to concentrate on women in minority businesses, around buildings and the whole, clean energy sector. So we also will be ramping up training and making sure that, like I like to say, from womb to tomb, right? If you're born, we want to get you into clean energy until your last day of life. So we want to make sure that all residents are aware, especially in those EJ communities, and they have that opportunity for access to training.
All right, Will, we're at time, but I would like to hear what's next for you.
So for us, I think really the next step is moving from our planning phase to our action phase on our Just Transition Action Plan. And that will be both through the utility planning process, but also I think this year is really where the rubber hits the road as the state really looks for money and resources to implement our Just Transition Plan.
And Phil, since you joined our panel, some concluding thoughts from you. Can you sort of sum up your terrific presentation and what you heard from our panel today, and what's next for you?
Well, I'm going to encourage everybody to read all 132 pages of the report and not just rely on the executive summary, or at least use it as reference material, because as we've seen, right, we don't want people to be sort of cherry picking data for what they think makes the most sense for them. It's really comprehensive. It's really exciting. I know it'll take some time, but as you develop your policy, we think that there's value in every page that's there. So I hope everyone will take the time to read through the report and use it for its approach. And just thank you so much for all hanging in there with us today, and sort of thinking through these really important issues of how we manage this transition for the benefit of everyone.
Well, I'd like to thank all of our panelists. I think you guys did a great job. Let's give ourselves a round of applause. And with that, I'll turn it back to NASEO and EFI if they have any closing comments for the broadcast here.
Thank you, Dave, so much for facilitating this great panel. Doreen, Will, Tamika, and Phil, it's been really informative. And again, just to echo Phil's remarks, please do check out the report. Let us know what you think, and have a wonderful day. Thank you again.